The man in the window, Samantha had always loved her apartment. It was small but cozy, and it felt like home. She had moved in 2 years ago and had decorated it exactly how she wanted. The best part was the large window in her living room. From there, she could see the city lights at night, and during the day, she could watch the world go by. The apartment was close to her job, and she had never had any problems living there. But things started to change. Small things at first. One evening, after coming home from work, she noticed that her curtains were slightly open. She was sure she had closed them in the morning. Maybe she had forgotten. She brushed it off. It had been a long day, and she was tired. But then it happened again and again. Sometimes, her kitchen cabinets were left slightly open. She knew she always closed them after using them. She had a habit of keeping things tidy. Yet, there they were, slightly open when she came home. Maybe she was just being careless. Maybe she was imagining things. Then the phone calls started. At first, they were just silent calls from an unknown number. She would answer, say hello, but there was nothing. Just silence. Then, after a few seconds, the call would end. It happened once or twice, and she ignored it. But then, the breathing started. She would answer the phone, and instead of silence, she would hear breathing. Slow, deep breathing. Someone was on the other end of the line, just listening. She hung up immediately, her hands shaking. It had to be a prank. Someone had the wrong number. The calls continued, always from an unknown number. Always the same slow, heavy breathing. Samantha started feeling uneasy in her own home. She made sure to lock her doors and double-check her windows. She even changed her locks, just in case. But nothing stopped the phone calls, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Then, one night, she saw him. She was sitting on her couch, watching TV, when she noticed something in the reflection of the screen. A dark shape, a figure standing by her window. Her heart stopped. She turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Her curtains were closed. She rushed to them and pulled them open, but the balcony was empty. Her apartment was on the third floor. There was no way someone could be standing outside her window. She told herself it was her imagination. Maybe she was just paranoid because of the phone calls. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. She called the police that night. They came and checked her apartment. There was no sign of a break-in, and the balcony door was locked from the inside. They reassured her that everything was fine and told her to stay alert. Samantha tried to move on, but the fear wouldn't leave her. A few nights later, she woke up suddenly. There was a noise, a faint scratching sound. She held her breath, listening. It was coming from the window. Her heart pounded as she reached for her phone. She wanted to turn on the light, but she was afraid. What if someone was out there? What if they saw her move? She stayed in bed, frozen, until the noise stopped. In the morning, she checked the window. There were faint marks on the glass, like scratches. Her hands trembled as she touched them. Something was wrong. She started sleeping with a knife under her pillow. She didn't feel safe anymore. One night, she had an idea. She decided to record her living room while she slept. She set up her phone on the kitchen counter, facing the living room, and went to bed. If something was happening, she wanted proof. The next morning, she checked the video. At first, everything seemed normal. The living room was empty. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Then, at 2:47 a.m., she saw it. A shadow moved across the floor. Slowly, a tall, thin man stepped into view. He had been hiding in the darkness. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. Then, he moved toward her bedroom. Samantha screamed and dropped her phone. She ran out of her apartment and called the police. This time, they took her seriously. The police searched her apartment carefully, and that's when they found it. A small crawl space above her bedroom closet. The cover had been moved. When they checked inside, they found signs that someone had been living there. The man had been hiding in her apartment, watching her, waiting. The police found some of Samantha's belongings inside the crawl space. Her old hairbrush, a few pieces of clothing, and even a used toothbrush. He had been taking things from her. He had been living above her room, crawling out at night while she slept. The police arrested him later that morning. He had a long history of stalking and breaking into apartments. Samantha moved out that same day. She couldn't stay there anymore. Even after he was caught, she never felt safe again. Every night, she checked her doors 3 times. Every noise made her jump. She had once loved her apartment. Now, she could never sleep without wondering if someone was watching. And she would never forget the man in the window. The stranger in my attic buying my first home was a dream come true. I had worked hard, saved every penny, and finally found the perfect house. It was old but full of charm, with wooden floors, large windows, and a cozy attic. The neighborhood was peaceful, and I was excited to start this new chapter of my life. At first, everything seemed perfect. I spent my days decorating the house, arranging furniture, and making it feel like home. The attic was mostly empty, except for a few old boxes left by the previous owner. I rarely went up there, but it felt good knowing I had extra space for storage. For the first few weeks, nothing strange happened. But then, I started hearing noises from the attic. At first, I dismissed them as the house settling. Old houses creak and groan, right? That's what I told myself. The sounds were faint, just small thumps and creaks. I assumed it was the wind or maybe mice running around. But as the days passed, the noises became louder and more distinct. I would hear what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving above me. It usually happened at night when everything else was quiet. I would be lying in bed, just about to fall asleep when I'd hear it. Thud, thud, thud. Someone or something was moving in my attic. Fear crept in, but I tried to stay rational. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe a squirrel or a raccoon had found its way inside. I convinced myself it was nothing and decided to check it out in the morning. The next day, I grabbed a flashlight and a broom, just in case. I hesitated before opening the attic door, my heart pounding. Slowly, I climbed the steps, feeling the air grow thick with dust. The attic was just as I had left it, empty except for the old boxes. I looked around carefully, shining my flashlight into every corner. There was nothing unusual. No sign of animals. No sign of anything, really. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. There were footprints, and they weren't mine. A chill ran down my spine. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Someone had been in my attic. But who? And how did they get in? I rushed downstairs and locked the attic door. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived quickly and searched the attic, but they found nothing. No one was there. No hidden entrances. No signs of forced entry. It's probably just an animal, one of the officers said. Maybe a raccoon got in through a vent. I nodded, but deep down, I knew better. Those were human footprints. Someone had been up there. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. It made me feel a little safer, but I still couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The wind outside, the ticking clock, even my own breathing. It all felt too loud in the silence. Days passed, and nothing happened. No noises, no footprints. I started to relax, convincing myself that maybe the police were right. Maybe it had been an animal, and it had already left. Then, one evening, I came home late from work. The house was dark, just as I had left it. But something felt off. As I walked in, I noticed my bedroom door was open. I always closed it before leaving. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my ears. I looked around, but everything seemed normal until I noticed the closet door. It was slightly ajar. I never left it open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy. Holding my breath, I reached for the closet door and yanked it open. There, crouched in the darkness, was a man. His clothes were filthy, his face covered in dirt. His eyes were wild and wide, staring at me like a trapped animal. I screamed and stumbled backward. The man bolted past me, shoving me aside as he ran toward the attic door. I was too shocked to move. My hands fumbled for my phone as I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. The police arrived within minutes. They searched the attic and found him hiding in a corner, curled up like a frightened child. He had been living in my attic for months. The police later told me he was a homeless man who had found his way into the house before I even moved in. He had been watching me, listening to me, and sneaking into my room while I slept. I moved out immediately. Even now, I have nightmares about it. The thought of someone living above me, hiding in the shadows, watching my every move, it still haunts me. I will never feel safe in a house alone again. The man who followed me home, it started like any other normal evening. I had finished work late and was walking home, just like I always did. The streets were busy with people heading home, cars honking, and streetlights flickering on as the sun set. It was a routine I was used to, but that night felt different. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. I was tired and lost in my own thoughts, thinking about what I would make for dinner. But after a few minutes, something made me feel uneasy. I had that strange sensation, the kind where you just someone is looking at you. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man walking behind me. He looked ordinary, dressed in jeans and a dark hoodie. I told myself it was nothing. It was a busy street, after all. People walk behind each other all the time. But as I kept walking, so did he. If I sped up, he did too. If I slowed down, he matched my pace. My heart began to beat faster. Was he really following me? Or was I just being paranoid? To test it, I turned a corner onto a quieter street. He turned too. I crossed to the other side. He followed. I stopped at a shop window, pretending to look at the display. He stopped a few feet away, pretending to check his phone. That's when I knew this wasn't my imagination. Someone was following me. Panic started to rise in my chest. My hands felt clammy. I tried to stay calm, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. Instead of going straight home, I decided to go to my friend Emily's apartment. It was only a few blocks away, and I knew it'd feel safer there. I walked faster, practically power walking now. The man kept up. My breathing became shaky. When I finally reached Emily's building, I hurried up the steps and knocked frantically. "Who is it?" she called from inside. "It's me. Open the door." My voice came out high-pitched, almost desperate. She opened the door quickly, taking one look at my face and pulling me inside. "What's wrong?" I turned to glance outside. The man was still there, standing on the sidewalk, watching the door. My stomach dropped. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Emily followed my gaze. "Who is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. But when we looked again, he was gone. That night, I tried to convince myself that maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe he just happened to be walking the same way as me. But the feeling of unease didn't leave me. The next day at work, I felt exhausted from barely sleeping. I told myself everything was fine, that I had imagined the whole thing. Then, as I was leaving work that evening, I saw him again. He was standing across the street, pretending to look at a newspaper stand. But he wasn't reading. He was watching me. Cold fear gripped me. I hurried back inside and told my boss, Mr. Anderson. He was an older man, kind but strict. "There's a man following me," I said, my voice shaking. "I saw him last night, and now he's here again." Mr. Anderson frowned. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "He's right outside." Mr. Anderson grabbed his coat. "I'll walk you to your car." We stepped outside together, but the man was gone. I looked up and down the street, but there was no sign of him. "Maybe it was just a misunderstanding," Mr. Anderson said. "But be careful, okay?" I nodded, though my gut told me this wasn't over. Over the next few days, I kept seeing him. Outside my gym, at my grocery store, sitting on a bench near the park where I went jogging. He never approached me, never spoke, but he was always there, watching. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining it? Was I being paranoid? I told Emily about it, and she suggested going to the police. "They might not do anything since he hasn't actually done anything yet," she said. "But at least they'll have a record of it." So, I went to the police station. I told them everything. The strange man, the way he followed me, the way he kept showing up. The officer listened and took notes. But in the end, he just said, "Well, keep an eye out. But if he hasn't threatened you or harmed you, there's not much we can do." I walked out feeling helpless. Then, one night, I woke up to a sound outside my window. I lived on the second floor of my apartment building, so at first, I thought it was just the wind. But something made me get up and check. When I peeked out the window, my blood ran cold. He was there, standing on the sidewalk, looking up at me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in gasps. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. "There's a man outside my window," I whispered, afraid to speak too loudly. "He's been following me." "Stay inside and keep your doors locked," the dispatcher said. "Officers are on their way." I sat on the floor, my heart pounding, waiting for the police to arrive. I kept glancing at the window, afraid he would try to climb up. When the police arrived, they searched the area, but he was gone. Again. But this time, they took it seriously. They asked if I had seen him before, and I told them everything. When they investigated further, they found something terrifying. He had been following me for weeks. He had taken photos of me. He had a notebook filled with details about my life, where I worked, where I shopped, what time I left my apartment each morning. He had been watching me for longer than I even realized. That night, They arrested him. It's been months since then, and he's gone. But I still feel his presence sometimes, like a shadow in my mind. I still look over my shoulder when I walk alone. I still lock my doors the second I get home, because I learned something important. Sometimes, the worst monsters aren't in stories. They walk among us, hidden in plain sight. And the scariest part? You never know when one might be watching you. The hidden cameras moving into a new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start for my best friend, Sarah, and me. We had been looking for a place for months, and when we finally found this one, it felt perfect. It was spacious, had plenty of natural light, and was in a nice neighborhood. The rent was reasonable too, which was a big relief. Everything seemed to fall into place, and we couldn't have been happier. On our first night, we unpacked our boxes and set up the living room. We were too tired to cook, so we ordered pizza and sat on the floor, eating straight from the box. "This is it," Sarah said, smiling. "Our new home." I nodded, feeling a sense of excitement. "Yeah, it's going to be amazing." For the first few days, everything was normal. We arranged our furniture, decorated the place, and settled in. It felt good to have our own space, and we were already making new memories. But soon, strange things started happening. At first, it was little things. A book would be out of place, even though I was sure I had put it back. The bathroom door, which I always kept closed, would be slightly open in the morning. Sarah noticed it too, but we both laughed it off. "Maybe we're just tired from moving in," she said. But then, things got weirder. Our food would go missing from the fridge. At first, we thought we were just forgetting what we ate. But one night, Sarah made pasta and put the leftovers in the fridge. The next morning, the container was empty. "I know I didn't eat it," she said, staring at the empty container. "Did you?" I shook my head. "No. Maybe we have a ghost?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. But deep down, I felt uneasy. One night, while watching a movie, I felt like someone was watching me. The feeling was so strong that I turned off the TV and looked around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake off the feeling. "Sarah, do you ever feel like someone's watching us?" I asked. She looked at me, her face serious. "Yeah." I thought it was just me. We both felt unsettled, but we didn't know what to do. Maybe we were just being paranoid. A few days later, Sarah was cleaning when she noticed something strange in the air vent. It was a small black object, barely noticeable. Curious, she reached in and pulled it out. It was a tiny camera. Her hands were shaking as she called for me. "Look at this," she whispered, holding up the camera. My heart started pounding. "Is that a camera?" We stared at each other in shock. Who had put it there? How long had it been recording us? Panic set in. We immediately started searching the apartment. We checked every vent, every corner, and every hidden spot. What we found was horrifying. There were cameras everywhere, behind picture frames, inside smoke detectors, and even in the bathroom. I felt sick. "Someone has been watching us," I whispered. The thought made my skin crawl. We didn't waste a second. We called the police right away. While waiting for them to arrive, we sat together on the couch, too scared to move. Every shadow, every sound made us jump. When the police arrived, they took the cameras and started investigating. It didn't take long for them to find out who was behind it. The previous tenant had installed the cameras and still had access to the apartment. He had been watching us the whole time. Hearing that made my stomach drop. I felt exposed, violated. Someone had been spying on us in our most private moments. The police arrested him, but that didn't erase the fear we felt. That night, we packed our things and left. We couldn't stay there another second. We didn't care that we had paid rent. We just needed to get out. We moved in with a friend for a while, still shaken from what had happened. It took a long time to feel safe again. Even now, I still check every room for hidden cameras whenever I move somewhere new. The fear never really goes away. We had been lucky to find the cameras when we did. I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't. But one thing is certain, I will never ignore that feeling of being watched again. The neighbor who wouldn't leave me alone, I was so excited to move into my new apartment. It was my first time living alone, and I was ready for a fresh start. The building was in a nice neighborhood, and my apartment was small but cozy. I had saved up for months to afford it, and finally, I had a place of my own. When I first met my neighbor, he seemed friendly. He was a man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had dark hair, a thin build, and a quiet voice. The first time we spoke, it was just a simple hello in the hallway. I smiled and said hello back. It was nice to have polite neighbors. At first, everything seemed normal. Every time I saw him, he would say hello or make small talk. He asked if I had just moved in, and I told him yes. He smiled and said, "Welcome to the building." I thought nothing of it. After all, neighbors should be friendly, right? But as the weeks passed, he started talking to me more and more. At first, it was harmless. He would ask how my day was or comment on the weather. But then, his questions became personal. He wanted to know where I worked. He asked if I lived alone. He asked what time I usually got home from work. Something about the way he asked these questions made me uncomfortable. His tone was too curious, too eager. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to share personal details with a stranger. So I gave short, vague answers. "I work downtown," I said, not telling him where exactly. "Yeah, I live alone," I admitted, but immediately regretted it. I felt uneasy after that conversation. Something about his questions didn't sit right with me. I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe he was just trying to be nice. But then, things started to get strange. One day, I found a note on my door. It was written on a small piece of paper. It said, "You looked beautiful today." I felt my stomach twist. Who left this? Was it him? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was my neighbor. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just a weird, one-time thing. But then, it happened again. A few days later, another note appeared. "I like watching you." My hands shook as I read it. This was not okay. Someone was watching me. Someone knew when I was coming and going. I started paying closer attention. Every time I stepped out of my apartment, I felt like someone was watching me. I noticed my neighbor more often. He always seemed to be around when I left for work or came home. Sometimes, he would be standing in the hallway, just staring. Other times, I would see him peeking through his blinds when I walked past his window. I stopped saying hello. I started avoiding him. If I saw him in the hallway, I would pretend to check my phone or take a different route. I didn't want to give him any more chances to talk to me, but avoiding him didn't help. One day, I opened my mailbox and found flowers inside. They weren't store-bought. They looked like they had been picked from somewhere, with long stems and a few wilted petals. Along with the flowers, there was a small charm, a tiny silver heart. I felt sick. I had never told my neighbor which mailbox was mine. I had never given him any reason to think I wanted gifts from him. And yet, here they were. I started feeling paranoid. I double-checked that my door was locked every night. I kept my blinds shut. I avoided going outside unless I had to. Then, one night, something happened that made my fear even worse. It was late, maybe midnight. I was in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something. A light tapping. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe it was the wind, or a tree branch brushing against the window. But then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My heart pounded. Slowly, I got up and walked to the window. I took a deep breath and pulled back the curtain. And there he was. My neighbor was standing outside my window, staring right at me. His face was blank, his eyes dark. I screamed. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice was panicked as I told them what was happening. The operator told me to stay inside and keep the doors locked until officers arrived. The next few minutes felt like hours. I stood frozen in my apartment, my heart racing. I checked the window again. He was gone. But that didn't make me feel any safer. When the police arrived, I told them everything. The notes, the gifts, the feeling of being watched. They knocked on my neighbor's door, but he didn't answer. After a while, they told me they couldn't do much unless he actually tried to hurt me. They gave him a warning. That was all. I felt helpless. For a few days, things were quiet. I thought maybe he had finally backed off. But then, the notes started again. I miss seeing you. Why don't you talk to me anymore? Every time I saw another note, my stomach sank. I knew he wasn't going to stop. I decided to get a restraining order. It was a long process. But eventually, I got one. The order said he had to stay away from me. It was supposed to protect me. But even then, I didn't feel safe. I would still see him in the hallway, just standing there, staring. I would catch glimpses of him through my window. Even though he couldn't legally come near me, I knew he was still watching. I started having nightmares. I was constantly afraid. My apartment, which had once felt like my safe place, now felt like a trap. I knew I had to leave. I packed my things and moved to a new city, far away. I changed my phone number. I told only a few people where I was going. Finally, I felt free. But even now, I still look over my shoulder. I still feel uneasy when I hear a noise outside my window. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, did he ever find someone else to follow?